Hello everyone, it's Norm. Welcome to the second OWL Talk, brought to you by the Project OWL OSINT community. For those who stumbled upon this podcast and do not know, OSINT stands for Open Source Intelligence, which is a methodology of collecting, analyzing, and making decisions about data accessible through public means. Project OWL is a wonderful resource that brings many people of all walks of life together to collaborate on this information, and you can find a link to join the conversation on our Discord server in the description below. These talks are recorded live and are geared towards giving the listeners some extra context with ever-evolving geopolitical events, while also highlighting some of our best contributors, giving them and users who choose to verbally ask questions valuable public speaking experience. This episode is really interesting, and I hope you learn as much as I did. Enjoy!
All right, well, let's go ahead and get this started. My name is ACR. Welcome to the OWL Talks from North Korea. I want to go ahead and start this off by saying that we will not be spending an hour and a half talking about the North Korean nuclear program. So if you're here for that, I'm sorry. We will talk about it, just not in that much of an extent. Today, I've got Global Mill Info and It's Happening 2021, both long-standing members of the OSINT community and the OWL server. They're going to be driving the show. I'm just going to be here kind of shaping the conversation and going along with everybody. Same rules apply as last time for anybody that was here. If anybody that wasn't here, I'll go through them real quick. If you have a question, there's a raise hand function at the bottom. Be sure to click that. And when we get to the question and answer portion, I will pull you in. We also have a discussion and question room. Please feel free to use that if needed. Now I'm going to pass the mic over to Global Mill, and he's going to give his little introduction, and then we'll go from there.
Hey guys, my name is Global Mill Info. Of course, I started my Twitter back in September of 2017. Of course, I do probably sound more younger than most folks here. I am 23 with a bachelor's in criminal justice criminology. I know, funny enough, being stuck with North Korea. But yeah, so this, pretty much I'm thankful that ACR, the Project OWL group, has allowed at least some sort of podcast to get established so we can, get some fun topics about North Korea and so forth. So my intent, this talk is, of course, I know everyone's here probably for the North Korean missile and nuclear program, but that is going to be touched upon. But I do plan on talking, to give you a little bit of an outline of what's going on. We do plan on talking about the life in North Korea. I know this is going to be something not a lot of people know about, so I'm excited to talk about it. And I do plan on ending out with a topic on nuclear diplomacy. So I'll pretty much get right into it. But I'll let It's Happening give us a little introduction and talk a little about himself, and we can move on to our first topic.
Hello, everyone. Welcome for joining this discussion. My name is It's Happening 2021. I appreciate ACR and the Project OWL Discord team for allowing us to have this talk today. I've been following North Korea since 2017, primarily. I do have a Twitter account. Its name is accurate_intel. And basically what I do with the account is just follow the most recent developments with North Korea, what's going on with its missile program, what's going on in the country, what are the rumors that are surrounding the country, and trying to disseminate the information between what's just hearsay, what's inaccurate information, and what's more accurate, what's more valid, because there's a lot of sensationalism that revolves around North Korea. And what I try to do is sift through all of the noise and get to what really matters with the country and just with geopolitics in the region in general.
Yeah, so I'll start it off. So, of course, I know a lot of us were here to discuss the nuclear and ballistic missile program of North Korea. So I'm actually going to start off with that. I know I've thought about an outline within this podcast for quite a bit, because we all know how complex and how in-depth a lot of the programs, life, diplomacy, all that fun stuff can be. So I tried to do it in three parts. We are going to discuss, of course, the relationships between Iran and China in regards to North Korea as a program, the weapon advancements have happened since the 60s, and of course, not that discussed topic is the actual nuclear triad and their command and control functions and how they represent differently from other countries. So I'll go right into it, and Happening, feel free to jump in whenever. But to mostly start off here is the relationships between China, Iran with North Korea are complex and have been known being occurring over many years here. So I think not a lot of people know is how actually in-depth they are. Of course, China is going to have the most influence. Is going to have the better relationship with North Korea than Iran does. But as time has tell, even most recently since 2017, News organizations such as CNN, Washington Post, New York Times have got confirmation from military officials that there's been more in-depth discussions, weapon transfers with Iran, North Korea in the past years, and there have been since the 60s. So pretty much to start off, kind of what's really going on here. A lot of the relationships kind of started after the Korean War and moving on to today. A lot of the stuff was pretty much getting back against the West, starting a buffer zone, starting regional crises to gain more attention with the world and moving on from there. I know I'll mostly dive in with Iran because it's not the most well-known topic, but what's actually going on within the country. So to pretty much start off here, a lot of the conversation started pretty much back in the 80s. A lot of actual proper developments between the two countries didn't start till more recently within the 2000s. I know it's definitely been a hard relationship because, regional differences, one's in the Middle East, one's in Asia. So the actual idea of secretly, transferring technologies, personnel, and so forth is kind of a hard dealing, knowing Western intelligence services with what they're looking out for. So pretty much the main intent of what happened with the transfer of sales was really with the Scud-C program between Iran and North Korea. The idea was attempt to mobilize each other's missile programs, generate funds, research, and actually help each other out. Of course, this stagnated for over a couple of years, mostly due to funding and trying to stay as secret as possible from Western services. But actually a major breakthrough came in between the middle to late 90s when they actually agreed of sharing oil funds and so forth to actually develop their missile programs. As you can see today, this is still ongoing. I won't go too much in depth because there's so much to talk about with Iran and North Korea nowadays, especially with Syria being involved as a key player. But the idea of missile transfers becoming more in terms from away from science research to missile applications is becoming more of a real deal, as we've seen with North Korea's missile program. So the communications are still ongoing, as we've seen for within the past years. Now, to the in-depth of how they're going is still unclear, and it probably will be unclear until something happens, probably in a few more years. But at the moment, we know for sure that personnel from North Korea are in Iran and in Syria doing, undercover research purposes, developing schemes and moving so forth. Now, likely within Iran's missile programs, a lot of missile parts, ideas are coming from North Korea. Don't get me wrong, Iran does have a lot of smart missile scientists, but North Korea is playing a key player in starting that up and continuing it. Now going to China and their involvement, I will say Russia and China do have some involvement within North Korea's missile program. It's hard to say to what extent, but the reason that has been developed is to keep a buffer zone between the West and China and Russia, especially within Asia. Now, these things, they're very complex. They're still ongoing. We don't know to what extent. As you can see from KCNA footage that North Korea releases with state approval, you can see some key resemblances to their missile programs, missile technologies, domestic vehicles, and so forth. So there's definitely conversations going on with all of these countries. We don't know to what extent. And of course, you don't want to go out and saying you're giving North Korea missile technology. So it is a kind of a very complex world. I'll pass off to Happening, see if anything else he'd like to add to the conversation with China and Iran.
Yeah, so there is a common picture among people, say in the United States specifically, who follow North Korea, like the picture that they're a hermit kingdom with no friends whatsoever, completely isolated from the entire world. But essentially that's not true, as Global already pointed out too. They do have a few friends, they have a few allies, and they want to cultivate the geopolitical relationships with their allies to produce the best possible outcome for the country. Now, a common picture that can be seen as well as the threat from North Korea, in quotes, can be seen as the missiles being fired, launched towards the United States mainland, and all those graphic pictures and imagery and things like that. However, what I do believe to be the more grave concern with North Korea is the potential for nuclear proliferation. And basically, nuclear proliferation is just exporting the nuclear technology and weapons to either state actors or even non-state actors. And these things can be difficult to track. So I don't have too much to add to Global's previous topic, but basically the importance of allies will be discussed quite a lot during this conversation. And that proliferation is a serious threat, and the threat can go under the monitor and not really be seen until the damages are done.
So yeah, I know. I mean, like you said, happening. It's definitely complex. I mean, the world's going to become more complex as we go forward, and at this point, it's really going to be hard to stop the progress without any concrete agreements. But of course, relationships are going to stand. I know China really is going to keep North Korea in its buffer zone as long as it can. And Iran is going to continue using the resources it can to cooperate with North Korea to go with their regional stakes, get their influence outwards, and so forth. But yeah, those relationships will stand. Of course, North Korea might develop relationships more in the future, but it's hard telling based on regional developments and COVID. But I can go ahead and move on to the actual weapon aspects of their program, because we know their program actually started in the 60s. Of course, this is with Scuds and so forth. It's nothing too crazy that what we see today. But it was small advancements. It wasn't meant to be where it was under Kim Il-jung's father, grandfather. These advancements were mostly brought to light in the 90s, what their purpose was going to be. But yes, in the 60s, the development was for just long-range artillery, engaging regional attacks, South Korea, Japan, and so forth. It wasn't meant to reach the U.S., Guam, and so forth. So, but these developments didn't come to light till the 90s with Nodong, with additional Scud, domestic making upgrades to it where the blankets were better, more aligned to their true goal, because the technology they had then was not as effective as it's today. It's quite remarkable if you actually take from the 80s to now and seeing how much they've progressed over the years. But pretty much to start off, North Korea has a wider range of artillery from conventional all the way to dual capabilities. So they do have short range, what we've been seeing since 2019, pretty much the KN-11, KN-25, all that fun stuff going on, the KN-23. So all these weapons they're developing for short range might not be of a big deal, but they are to the point where they're becoming dual use, and they're actually trying to make them dual use. It's hard to say if North Korea is really going to have to willing to use nuclear weapons in future, but of course we'll go more into that when we go further along the conversation here. But their weapons, in terms of short range, intermediate, SLBMs, ICBMs. Of course, ICBMs, SLBMs are probably very notable because of their capabilities and what they're meant to do. Of course, once we move on to the next discussion, I'll actually talk about their triad, but mostly in the mere sense of their weapon capabilities. The most important ones can be the HS-15 and HS-16, which happening. I've discussed this in the past of their ICBM program. Their HS-16, which is not fully known as the actual name of it, was dubbed back in January of this year when we all saw it on the parade that happened. The HS-15 was known back in 2017. And these capabilities, of course, are directly for engaging Western allies, especially the U.S. I know back in 2017, the state TV leaked a strategic outline map that the KPA missile force had in engaging multiple cities in the U.S. Of course, this capability is still known, and of course, we don't really know if they can actually make it until they do a standard trajectory. The trajectories they've been doing now are lofted, which you shoot them as high up in the air, and they go in a reduced kilometer range. So like I said, a lot of these were either going over Japan, going in the sea of Japan. That's where they're keeping it as testing it. It's probably the best way of doing it. But if they ever wanted to make a proper picture of what they're kind of doing in the future, they would do a standard trajectory towards the Pacific, towards Hawaii. But of course, there's consequences of doing so. That's why they haven't really done it yet. But yeah, their program at the moment will maintain, and they will kind of continue to refine their capabilities. So they are a threat to regional allies, to the U.S., and so forth. But I know to an extent, there's going to be a point where development will cease, where they're kind of happy where they are and go on for modification and so forth. Pretty much like the U.S., the Minuteman program, we're just sustaining it until we're ready to move on to another ICBM program from there. So pretty much what's going to happen, I know the one keys of their advancements is they're actually, with their short range, we're seeing a lot of influence with Russian short range projects, intermediate. I know at the moment, the actual test launch that happened in 2021 in April, March and April, around there, the actual missile did a up maneuver, which means when it went low, went towards the ocean, it jumped back up. It jumped up. It continued path to about 600 kilometers, which was about 200 less than what the South Korean military detected. Of course, that is an issue in itself. But they are making short missiles more of a priority to get past the THAAD, PAC-3, any type of short-range missile they have in South Korea and going from there. Of course, these are major matters to regional. I know they might not get the coverage they probably deserve, but they are allowing North Korea to attempt to get past South Korean defenses, engage strategic targets in South Korea, and maybe even use nuclear if they need to. But from going on from there, their program is still setting ahead. Even all these talks and stuff might have stopped actual showing the test, but they haven't actually stopped any type of research and production of them. And I'll pass this on to Happening, as I know he'll definitely have more to say about it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So I guess just looking at the history of North Korea and their nuclear weapons programs, there is no doubt among people that their program has advanced significantly in the past maybe 5 to 10 years per se. But also, I do want to give a little bit of a historical example. So there have been times in the past where tensions have been rising between the United States and North Korea, and the United States leadership has contemplated decisions, possibly even drastic decisions, to try to halt the nuclear weapons advancements of the DPRK, which is the official name of North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so eventually, these times of high tension and times where miscalculation could be rampant eventually died down. But these things don't just happen once. They tend to repeat themselves. See, in 1994, the Clinton administration was contemplating surgical strikes on North Korea's nuclear facilities because North Korea was at the point where they could develop up to, I believe, 2 nuclear bombs, something around that range. But the administration decided that diplomacy would be the better outcome and the better route because the cost of a military strike would be too high. And that is in 1994. That is long before North Korea developed their ICBMs. That is 12 years before North Korea tested their first nuclear weapon. See, if in 1994, the price of a military action to disarm the North was considered too high by the American administration, how much higher would that cost be, say, in 2017, when the Trump administration had their, quote, fire and fury crisis with North Korea? How much higher would the cost be to conduct a military operation there? Because in the span of those 2 decades, North Korea was able to conduct 6 nuclear tests. They were able to conduct 3 ICBM tests. They were able to strongly enhance their nuclear program by developing much more advanced SLBMs, much more advanced intermediate range missiles. SLBMs are just submarine launched ballistic missiles. Sometimes people can confuse SRBMs, short range ballistic missiles, with SLBMs, submarine launched ballistic missiles. But at the end of the day, all of their missiles and their nuclear technology has enhanced greatly in the past years. There's also been this perception among some people in the United States that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is just a joke, or that their missile tests tend to fail every so often. But the problem with that analogy is that it doesn't matter whether their missile tests fail or succeed per se. If it succeeds, that's the ideal outcome for their weapons advancements. But if it fails, that's just more data. That's just more lessons for the weapons development program to gather and to collect, so that in the future their tests will succeed. We saw that happening, I believe, in 2016 and 2017 when they were the most active in missile tests. They failed a bunch of tests in the early part of 2017. They had global mockery for failing their tests, and people were presuming that, the threat is no longer that big of a deal since they kept failing their tests. But then suddenly the tests stopped failing. The lessons were learned. The missile tests grew more significant. The short range progressed to medium range. The medium range progressed to intermediate range. On America's Independence Day in 2017, they tested their first ICBM, quite the symbolic gesture to the United States and its allies. In August 2017, they tested a Hwasong-12 or HS-12 intermediate range ballistic missile. It wasn't the first time that they tested that, but what was different from it is that they fired it on a normalized trajectory. So when they test missiles, just a bit of context for that, they tend to fire them almost vertically up into the air and then straight back down into the East Sea or the Sea of Japan, depending on how you want to name it. And they do that because they want to mitigate the tensions as much as possible. They want to get the data for their weapons program without causing an international conflict or crisis. However, that can only do your your nuclear missile program so much before you actually have to test it on a normalized trajectory. And so in August 2017, when they did test it on the normalized trajectory, it activated the J alert system in Japan, or the Japanese alert system. This J alert system, you may have heard from basically natural disasters in the past in Japan, like tsunamis, earthquakes. But the J alert system also is relevant for any missile alerts. And so it was activated in a real world setting, not once, but 2 times in 2017, as North Korea continued to enhance their missiles and test them on normalized trajectories. We were heading on a path towards a ICBM normalized trajectory test, because in November 2017, they tested their most advanced ICBM to date, the Hwasong 15 or HS-15, which if fired on a normalized trajectory could strike anywhere in the continental United States, anywhere from California to DC and anywhere in between. Essentially, the only place where their ICBMs cannot hit, theoretically, is the southern portion of South America. And there is still some doubt whether the re-entry vehicle can survive on a supposed ICBM test. But we don't want to find out whether it can succeed, because if we find out, that means we've already lost more ground from a U.S. perspective. We've already allowed North Korea's missile program and nuclear program to progress to such a rate that denuclearization would be all but impossible. Some may argue that that is already the case. I'm not going to dive into the debate at the moment. But essentially, that pattern was stopped by the diplomacy efforts in 2018, just like North Korea's missile developments were temporarily halted after the 1994 agreed framework. But despite these deals, North Korea's program continued to develop behind the scenes. We know that because they were able to conduct nuclear tests in 2006 and in the years following that, even though they stopped missile tests from 1994 to, I believe, 2002, save for one satellite test in 1997, or one missile test in 97. Now, in 2018 through 2021, their tests have been limited to short-range missiles and I think one SLBM. But who's to say that they aren't still developing their nuclear program quietly in the background? And who would blame them? There is no official deal in place. The summits produced very vague deals in general, which really did not have specific limits or caps to their nuclear program. And so it is all but reasonable to expect that if they do resume testing again, whether it's this year or in the near future, we could see new weapons that we have not seen tested from them before. And so if the pattern of 1994 repeats, we will expect to see more tests in the future. But history is unpredictable. Things can change. So we'll see what happens in the near future.
Well, I appreciate that. That's definitely a far more in depth of what's going on with their weapons program, their goals, and going from there. So I am going to slide into the next topic, which is actually the nuclear triad and the command and control that North Korea is trying to establish to make itself an actual nuclear power. Of course, I am going to branch off to the SLBM program, which is becoming more to light, especially what's been going on lately with stat images at SINPO, and then going on from there. I know most importantly, the SINPO is kind of mostly known as the testing area for most of their SLBM co-launches, and going from there. It has been seeing some activity, especially with the sub-arch that has been used, I believe has been modified, or at least maintenance for future tests. I know the idea is those tests will resume this year to continue showing that they're making progress and making a lot more progress in terms of actually establishing their triad. Now, the triad with the SLBM program is called the PUC series. I know we started from the PUC 1 to the PUC 4 now. There is, I believe, the PUC 2 is known as the land variant of a cold launch derived from the PUC 1, but most currently the PUC 3 was test launched in October of 2018, which made it into the economic zone of Japan, and now the PUC 4, which was also showed at the parade in January of this year. Now, we believe those ranges are mostly regional. That can reach Guam, so they don't really impact the United States in any terms of like that. But the idea of creating a second strike regional, mostly in terms of any type of attack on North Korea, is valuable to them. So they're able to inflict damage even if their missile force is down. Progress is still going. Like I said, tests are still being conducted. But in terms of the triad, so far, progress on their land variants has been very successful and ongoing. C is still in a research phase before operational capability, and there's nothing really in the air that North Korea is really working on to create almost like, how the U.S. has a B-52 program, B-2 program, anything like that. The Air Force that the KPA have are very Soviet style, nothing too crazy. That would be too scary to South Korea, Japan, the U.S. But any type of military application will do damage no matter how you use it. But in terms of the nuclear dual use, especially in a conflict, North Korea might attempt to place a miniaturized nuke onto the bottom of one of their flankers or so forth, almost how most countries try to do it, of any capability at the last-ditch effort, but they don't really have a program ongoing for their air. So their triad is really just pretty much their land and sea, and they'll continue to make progress on that. So mostly in the terms of their command and control, not much is known, but North Korea does have a vast variety of underground command and control functions, mostly been development since the 50s after the U.S. Air Force had air superiority over the Korean Peninsula then. But these underground structures are kind of dual use of what they want to do, conventional nuclear. But hard telling is, I guess the number one question is, not really people know, is like, how would Kim Jong-un activate his missile force? And from there, I know I am going to go from Jeffrey Lewis, who's also an expert on WNDs and has focused on North Korea, wrote a book called The 2020 Commission of the Attack on the United States by North Korea. And now in that book, with it being, not real, he did discuss the fact of how would North Korea actually launch any type of missile nuclear attack on regional the U.S. of like what would really partake in that. So the idea is it could be as simple as a phone call from Kim Jong-un. I know most recently how they flattered back in 2018 how Kim Jong-un had a button on his desk he can activate his nuclear forces. I know most cases that's kind of far-fetched. I mean, really with North Korea that could be very true, but in terms of actual logistics and communications, it's probably far-fetched to where North Korea actually probably developed something called the football themselves. So the idea of actually launching is really unknown, which is scary to most parts. The U.S. intelligence services and South Korean intelligence services likely have a better idea than we do now. But the initial key goes down to probably Kim Jong has a cell phone of how that information gets transferred out. But sadly, we'll never know until we actually face that situation. And of course, whenever the dust settles for take, we would actually know. But for clarification, that's really what the North Korea is working on in terms of establishing itself as a nuclear power. And the command and control functions are there, but it is unclear how those would be activated. So that would pretty much kind of simmer down of really everything and beginnings of their missile and nuclear program, what they're trying to achieve here. I mean, Kim Jong-un is a very smart and strategic man. He will back himself in the corner if he benefits from it. Of course, he's willing to solidify his internal views, expand his influence with, tactical, strategic, and provocations. But everything has a purpose of what he does, what his goals are. So the missile program might be far-fetched, but he's learned from Iraq, he's learned from Libya. So these incidents are not just out of the blue. Of course, North Korea is not looking to create conflict with anyone. I know with their recent moves, like in 2010 and so forth, it seems like they really want to up the T. But those were calculated maneuvers. What they were wanting to do is be recognized as a nuclear power and maintain the Kim regime and going from there. That pretty much concludes the missile program concept of what this talk is. I'm going to maneuver towards the actual life in North Korea. I know this is a topic that's not really discussed till you actually hear about the sanctions. Of course, UN getting involved. With COVID, it's probably more of an idea what's going on. Do they really have COVID within the country? But to really kind of start off that discussion here, I actually was fortunate enough to do my own report on the criminal justice system that North Korea has within the country. I know criminal justice has been a hot topic recently around the world, especially with COVID going on, especially a lot of ongoing political events and so forth. So I thought it'd be an interesting tidbit to add within the secret of state of knowing what kind of the criminal justice system holds, what's really going on within this country. Like I said, it's completely different. It's kind of mind-boggling what's going on, how they adapt with life and go from there. A lot of the information I was able to pull from my actual project was from old documents, defectors, and going from there. So these should be somewhat of an accurate account of what's going on. Of course, times have changed. I won't have the most accurate information at this time, but it should give you an idea of what really is going on within the country. Before I fully start into it, I'll let Happening, if he has anything to discuss, mostly if he knows anything, or has anything else to discuss in regards to the nuclear triad before I fully move on to this topic.
Yeah, I don't know if we have enough time to discuss a little more about the triad, but if we do, I'm just going to sum it up quickly. So as Global pointed out, there are 3 portions to a nuclear triad, but the strategic bombers is probably the weakest part of the triad for North Korea. They have shown a more advanced ICBM called the Hwasong-16 ICBM that has not been tested yet, but it's supposedly bigger than the 15 and can go a longer range, probably have a bigger warhead as well. But we haven't seen that tested yet, so details are hard to come by. For submarine-launched ballistic missiles, North Korea has shown that they are building a new submarine so that they can launch SLBMs with. However, that has still not been paraded as of this day, so we really don't know when that's going to happen. But when it does, their SLBM program will advance even further. And another point I wanted to bring up is that with the nuclear triad and with just any country's nuclear program, it's important to know who's in charge. And right now, the answer is pretty clear. It's Kim Jong-un. There have been rumors sometimes of Kim Jong-un's health in the past. I believe at least 2 times since he took power, he disappeared from state media for a prolonged period of time, and or U.S. media started to speculate and swirl around rumors about his health. The reason why that is so significant is because as of now, Kim Jong-un has no clear successor. There are rumors of who would succeed him. We may talk about that later as well. But the problem with that is instability. If Kim Jong-un were to somehow die unexpectedly or go into a coma or something like that, there is no clear picture of who would take over, and that is not a fun topic to think about. If someone takes over who is not as forward-thinking and calculating as Kim Jong-un, they could make irrational decisions, rash decisions as well, and just hasty decisions to take any military action that's necessary to solidify their control. And with the nuclear weapons that North Korea has at the moment, that could produce a very ugly picture. It's possible that this scenario does not happen, but the only way to assure that it doesn't happen is to keep the progression of leadership stable in North Korea. And that's what we currently have at the moment. But it could always change without warning. So that's something that Western intelligence and people along those lines still have to be concerned about and have to calculate responses to any potential hypothetical future development.
Yeah, appreciate that. So I guess we can go ahead and move on to kind of the, of course, criminal justice system, life in North Korea, and so forth. Like I said, these are topics that are not really widely discussed or too much is known about, but does have the attention, of course, the U.S. most recently, of course, with the UN, especially with COVID going on. Of course, we want to make sure the citizens of North Korea are well, thriving, and so forth. But kind of kick it off with the criminal justice program. Of course, not much is known. It is developed within the country to maintain balance, especially with state-sponsored stuff, make sure people are doing what they need to do and go from there. But the idea of actually having a working police force is a bit in the middle. Of course, they have a police. They have pretty much everything, a Western country would have. But like I said, they are state-sponsored. They have the do's and the don'ts. The stuff that might be a don't in the U.S. or a do in North Korea. They get by actually, crime. North Korea might say they eradicated crime. That's untrue. Crime is actually like a well-known aspect of North Korea's way of life. People bribe, people do drugs, people trade black market items and so forth. That's how they get by. And that's becoming more state-sponsored because of the sanctions and so forth going on within their country. So in terms of the hierarchy, of course, it's like local court systems make their way to state sponsored like Supreme Courts. It's a wacky subject, and the hierarchy is very strange of how things are done. But a lot of things are delegated to the pretty much local counties. I guess you can call it almost like how the states have their own counties. But everything is pretty much divided in counties, regions, and so forth. So the idea of delivering punishment is pretty quick. The judge has kind of a lot to say of what they want to do. But if something does happen in the future, it could be moved up depending on the crime. Say if it's something with, against the state, it would actually move up to the, KPA Supreme Court, where most punishments are either death or political imprisonment and moving on from there. Of course, I know this is definitely a way of life, so that's why you always see how attack based on images or how wide and huge political camps are, prison camps are, and to output anything. But yeah, so I know the criminal justice program there is very screwed up of how things are conducted and what do's and don'ts happen. I know it's still ongoing. There's not really any reforms to it. Like most recently, Kim Jong-un attended a youth, assembly to talk about the teens' youth. I know the ideas were to stop video game addictions, stop doing drugs and all that fun stuff. I mean, it's never really going to stop. It's kind of the way of life. The idea is to, if they can, at least control the way of life effectively, even though they might be, doing crimes or so forth. But the idea, if they can at least maintain some sort of control, maintain the ideology of the Kim regime, they're good to go. But the system, like I said, won't really kind of change to a point. There might be times where, some things might be flexible. Like I said, a lot of people get by bribing officials. So if you do something bad, you bribe the police officer, never happened. But these ideas that, anything else is happening within the country is kind of false. This is kind of how way of life is. North Korea's always going to say something different. But the idea that life is kind of normal or everyone's happy is completely untrue. People are doing things to get by, and criminal activities are promoting the economic system, which we'll go in a bit later. I mean, that's kind of like the basics of really their criminal justice program. Like I could go on and on about this because there's actually a little bit, a decent amount out there. Like I said, a lot of this could be changing based on time, as I did this report probably 5 years ago. But a lot of stuff that's ongoing is, well, with documents in the Ministry of State Security, Ministry of People Security. So, things are kind of delved down to state crimes, to local petty crimes that are still subjected to punishments based on the officer and the judge, and going from there. But the most prominent crimes you see within North Korea are actually going to be, human trafficking, drug trafficking, corruption, murder, robbery, political oppression, and so forth. Of course, like I said, these are all going to be denied, but they do happen. And it's the way of life of what's really how they grasp of staying alive, doing what they need to do, and going from there. Of course, these are crimes, don't get me wrong, but people do this to get by. Like I said, they don't get punished because you're limiting competition, one less person to feed. It's pretty crazy, but that's kind of how it's done. Of course, all these things are in the rise because of their economic depression, but of course the police force is involved within corruption, committing these crimes and so forth. But by far the most elite in terms of the police is going to be the Ministry of State Security, Ministry of People Security. Like I said, these are two divided. State security, anything with state crimes. Say if you go tear down the propaganda picture of Kim Jong-un, you're done by the Ministry of State Security. For Ministry of People Security, they kind of deal with murders, kind of petty thefts, stealing, so forth. They deal with all that stuff. Of course, the state security is more employed, more paid off. People security, kind of like petty county sheriffs, offices, stuff like that. But the main people that actually kind of, watch mind people, terrorists that come in the country to, of course, before COVID, the main watchers were the state Ministry of State Security. Those were the minders. Those are the people you finally see on, YouTube, on documentaries, constantly watching over people. Those people are employed by state security to make sure they're doing what they need to do. But to mostly go into the step of kind of like due process, there's really no proper due process. They do have their own constitution. They do have pretty much their own laws and stuff here. The problem is it's not really followed to a point. A lot of this stuff is kind of just, it happens, go on your way and go from there. But in terms of actually of a proper due process, people have their rights. Can people do whatever they want? I mean, it's half and half. This is kind of the life of North Korea, and people are just living by it. So, like I said before, it won't likely change. This is just how it's going to happen. But in terms of kind of like getting things back to normal before COVID, it's probably going to be a bit, and this, crime will prosper for quite a bit, a few more years, 100%. Now, in terms of their prison systems, we all know about political prisoners. We all know about state-sponsored prisoners, the penal system, all that stuff. So all of it, most times, you have a penal system that forces people inside a giant, large camp. They work till they're done with their term, which can be from forever for 2 years, state-sponsored. But the idea of forced labor is kind of the driving force of their penal system. Like I said, you don't really have everyone can give their fair share. So the penal system is what really allows people to, or allows the state system to prosper in getting needed materials for weapons program, economy reforms, and going from there. So that's pretty much the touch-up of it. It's a very complex, it's very kind of like straightforward system, but based on all these images we see from satellites, of course, the camps get larger, it's getting more crowdier. It's just how they deal with it. It's very complex, it's very inhumane, but of course, nothing's really going to change. And North Korea dismisses any opportunity to discuss it, which goes into human rights. Of course, I'm not sure happening if you have much knowledge of the criminal justice program, but I know you definitely have any knowledge about the daily life. So you're more than happy to say or have we'll go ahead and bring any type of info you have to the table if you have any.
Yeah, so I don't really have as much information about the criminal justice system as Global does. However, I do want to just touch upon a couple of things. It is the purpose of these criminal justice systems and authorities in North Korea is they want to maintain the authoritarian grip of power of the state over the people. That means crushing any form of dissent whenever possible, suppressing the intake of foreign media or Bibles or religious content or any type of ideology, no matter which direction, that threatens the ideology of the Kim regime or the ideology of Juche, which is something that is pushed by North Korea. If someone is caught with these contraband materials, depending on the type of material that they possess, they could be sentenced to jail or even sort of, I don't even know what the proper term is, concentration camps or just some sort of inhumane prison center, but whatever you want to define it. The life of someone who gets caught with possession of those materials is not for the best. Now, there has been talks of rumors of potential leaflets being sent to North Korea in the past week. There hasn't really been an independent confirmation of that. That's one of the ways people in the South try to send information to the North, because it's their belief that with information and with the extra depth of perception that comes with that information, it can cause reform in the North and possibly even the downfall of the regime. However, the effectiveness of such an approach is questionable. There's no really definitive study or scientific paper which has an authoritative conclusion about that. However, there have been defector testimonies in the past that have said that getting this type of information, whether it was South Korean media, whether it was a Bible or religious materials, into the North has caused people to defect and caused people to abandon the Kim regime, which is exactly why the regime wants to suppress this information. Any suppression of dissent will lead to a stronger chance that the people will follow the system which is installed in North Korea by the regime, and any suppression of any harsh consequences, even extreme consequences, such as public executions or sending generations of families into prisons, things along those lines, can all send a message to the rest of the population saying that if you even think about engaging in these prohibited activities, the consequences will be swift for yourself and everyone else that you know. So I don't really have too much else to add to that, Global, but
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's definitely more than enough. And mostly in terms of the leaflets, because I believe we'll go more into that when we actually get to the round table for the question and answers. I know that's more of a hot topic most recently. But to continue down the outline here, I'm going to go a little bit more rapid fire, mostly in terms of like the propaganda, daily duties, and so forth, because a lot of this stuff all mashes together. It's all meant to mash together for internal influence and going from there. I know one of the most important things is I'm not really sure if people pay attention. I know a few people I've spoken to know the idea of it, but they don't know what it represents. I know once you see on KCTV, KCNA, any type of documentaries of North Korea, you see the civilians. Of course, most importantly, you see a little pin representing the Kim regime. So that actually matters, actually represents something. So the larger it is means the more influence you are in, because you know how the U.S., or in terms of the economic system, we have like the middle class, the high class, the elites, the low class, and so forth. So the smaller it is, the lesser influence you have that the Kim regime cares about you. The larger your pin is around your heart, actually matters of what you can do, what your influence is, what your position is. So that's actually how kind of way of life is done in terms of like where people are in their society. So if you ever see Pyongyang, that's actually one way is you can tell where a lot of middle class people, their pins are decent size. And you actually, once you get closer to more state sponsored buildings, those pins get larger and larger. They represent either the Kim dynasty or at least just Kim Jong-un. So that's pretty much how their way of life goes. It also represents how much income or money they have, which of course is pretty important, especially in stimulating their economy. So that's just a little fun fact I wanted to bring in case people didn't know. So next time, whenever you wanted to watch KCNA or watch an old documentary, just pay attention to the local citizens and actually seeing what they are, and kind of gives you an idea where they are in society. So that's just one of the little fun thing is I just wanted to bring up. I hope you all like that part. But I'll go ahead and move on to the, of course, next aspect, which is propaganda. Of course, propaganda is their everyday of life. You will see pretty much everywhere, mostly in the terms of state-sponsored television, posters, foreign propaganda, all that fun stuff. So there is two meanings to this. And I know the most hardest part is when do you know it's actually towards a foreign audience? So A, if it's on KCNA, it's on Rodong, which is the other most famous North Korean newspaper, those two are the main factors. If you start seeing propaganda that's towards the U.S. or against the U.S., a lot of times it's meant to coverage. It's meant just to kind of anger the population, to continue them working at the mines, continue working at the factories, and stifling their military and their economy. In most cases, the ones that kind of delve more coverage, we dub her the Pink Lady. Pink Lady comes on for massive influence of pretty much coverage in terms of foreign development, missile tests, nuke tests, any type of American propaganda that's actually meant for us, for our leaders, Western leaders, South Korea, and so forth. So there are different ways of how they outreach their propaganda. Like I said, propaganda, slogans on their tanks, movies, television segments, all this stuff. So they all have a purpose, and not every time we see something in KCNA that's meant for us doesn't go to the local population. Some stuff they do keep hidden. Some stuff is just meant for us, experts, people who watch it for fun, our leaders and so forth. So of course, over the years, 2017 was a huge one in terms of anti-American propaganda and South Korean propaganda. So you saw the fist hitting the U.S. You saw the videos of a nuclear missile, of course, hitting D.C. back in 2013. All this stuff they have developed over the years. Most recently, after the diplomacy or the fall in tensions, propaganda shifted from anti-American to economic. So everything was promoting the state, helping the economy move forward, helping with raw minerals and so forth. Now, most recently, especially at the parade that happened this year, it's hard telling. Of course, if you're not fluent, you don't understand Korean or have never looked into it. Their tanks actually do have slogans on it, and most recently, like the Puck 4. It does have a slogan saying it's C variable, but most of their main battle tanks, APCs, AA vehicles, all that stuff do have slogans of anti-American propaganda. It's just something to boost patriotism, military morale, going from there. So propaganda will be a big part. Of course, whoever watched KCNA, you are going to be influenced by it. It sounds cheesy, it sounds crazy, but the sounds they use, the videos they show, is meant to indoctrinate their local population. And or those around the world, because there are North Korean followers who are not within the country, Japan, Britain, who actually are diehard state patriots, and that's actually for them too, including the radio broadcast, which we don't really hear too much about before, but a broadcast was started many years ago that was actually meant for operatives within South Korea, Japan, U.S., of giving them assignments, giving them tasks to do, updating information. Of course, we have listened to it. We can't, you don't make too much about it. I do believe South Korean intelligence services have admitted that they were able to decipher it, and not long after that information came out, it stopped. But yeah, there are different ways that North Korea has done this, and it will likely continue solidifying the Kim regime. I know happening. I'm not sure if you have anything else to add on this, but you're more than happy to say.
Yeah, Global, you covered most of it quite well. I don't have too much to add. The Pink Lady appears more often than people think, because sometimes I notice there's comments like, oh, the Pink Lady is on television. That means something significant is happening. Well, something significant is going on, but it may not be our definition as a Western perspective definition of significant. Primarily, she reports on Kim Jong-un's activities. So whether that's watching a missile test or inspecting something before a nuclear test, signing off on the order, she will appear on the screen. Or whether it's just his trip to a farm or a trip to a domestic location in which he makes an appearance and gives guidance to the people to boost morale, that may also get a Pink Lady appearance. So just because she shows up does not necessarily mean something significant is going on with the US and North Korea, or even South Korea and North Korea. Another just probably not really that well-known fact about North Korea is the attire of the spokesperson can reveal a lot. Essentially, if you're watching Korean Central Television on an evening and the broadcast just starts and you suddenly see the spokesperson dressed in all black, that means you're about to witness history before anyone else even knows it, because that means they are about to announce the death of the leader of North Korea. We know this because this happened in 2011 when Kim Jong-il passed away. The speaker, who was the quote-unquote pink lady, was not dressed in pink. She made the announcement to the people about the death of their leader, who died a couple days before the announcement was made. So just little details like that can sometimes give away when big events are about to happen. Global talked about the newspaper, the Rodong Shinmun, I believe is how it's pronounced. That is more towards the domestic audience, the citizens of North Korea. There can also be Korean Central News Agency bulletins. I believe those are more directed towards foreign audiences and just people around the world. If they really want people to know, they will publish it in all avenues. If they only want a certain aspect of people to know, they will publish it in the certain channels. It's all controlled by the state. There is nothing that they publish that is an accident. Anything that they publish has already been approved by the state censors and the state media so that their ideology can be spread to whoever they want to spread it towards.
So that's pretty much the understanding of the pink lady. I mean, like you said, she's actually on a lot more than people think, but she is in the spotlight when nuclear missile tests and so forth happen. So I appreciate you emphasizing that. I am going to skip ahead so we have enough time for questions and people to actually talk to us about this. I'm actually going to move to nuclear diplomacy. Of course, this is kind of what's been hopping on around. I've actually spoke to ACR about this. Is most recently, now people know if we're keeping up to date, because North Korea is kind of a once the top flame each year. They have their moments to die down, have another moment, and go from there. But most recently, the Biden administration has announced that they're done with their North Korean pretty much policy review, which was a comprehensive review of what worked, what didn't work, what could help, and pretty much meetings with local allies of Japan, South Korea, any other interested party of it. Now, not much has been actually said about it. We know it's done. We know that officials have stated that the idea is actually go something in the middle. So to break that down, to what they described it, Trump was all or nothing, Obama was nothing for nothing, and then the Biden administration is aiming for something for something. So that's actually what we're kind of dubbing the policy is something for something policy. So the idea here is based on my understanding, based on what sources have said, is that they're going to try and do smaller type of deals to influence something that was possibly trying to happen at the Hanoi summit between Kim Jong-un and Trump, of a partial sanction relief. So that's something that the Biden administration might be going towards. It's hard telling if it will be effective or not. Earlier this year, North Korea have openly said that they did not engage the Biden administration because they're just buying for time and don't believe it would work. Now, to actually echo off that, I know there should be some appeasement with North Korea. The understanding is why would North Korea go into a deal with the U.S.? Because every 4 to 8 years, the administration changes. Within the next another 8 years, we could have another president who is a diehard against North Korea and stops any type of agreement with them. So that's why the diplomacy is off and on all the time, and it's always a struggle to get to the understanding of what is for the national security interest of the U.S. and what North Korea is trying to do the national security interest for themselves. So the diplomacy world of nuclear powers is actually very complex, very hard, and especially with the administration's movements to the Kim regime, is going to be forever more complex until something's actually agreed upon. But like I said, multiple agreements within the years have broken down. Provocations have restarted and so forth. So it's really hard telling to say if the problem will ever be solved, especially with the Afghanistan withdrawal. It took 20-some years before a decision was fully made to pull out and go from there. But to pretty much start on the main point, I did highlight this section to be reactionary of pretty much how does the world react to North Korea. And then most importantly, we know the idea of provocations, depending on what they are, kinetic, to missile tests, nuke tests. Main withdrawal is to the UN, sanctions. Now the problem is China is part of the security community, same as Russia. Russia has been more a part of being on board of sanctioning because they don't want nuclear tests happening in their backyard. They don't want anything happening in the Asian Pacific region that cause tensions. China, on the other hand, has been off and on. Yes, they did agree on multiple times to actually reenact UN sanctions, especially in 2017. But B, there's a point of actually on board of enacting sanctions and on board to enforcing sanctions. Now, the idea here is pretty much that's how kind of North Korea is still on the float. There are some nations not enforcing it and letting illicit trades happen on the open sea. There's still active trade going on between China and North Korea. They've been actually exceeding to almost pre-COVID levels, especially because COVID has hit North Korea hard in terms of what their quarantine and their policies towards it. So the reactions kind of countries have, of course, is sanctions is one, enforcement is another, and like I said, now the idea of actually enforcing sanctions is B. There's been a very few times, especially when Iran's brought up, of actual Western allies actually stopping cargo ships boarding and docking them somewhere to be stopped for a bit for investigation. Now, it's actually hard to do that. As North Korea said, any type of quarantine or any type of engagement with their vessels will be an act of war. Now, it's actually hard, in terms of relating back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, A, yes, you could quarantine North Korea. B, is it the concussions or the consequences of doing so. It's going to be hard to enforce anything. Like I said, pretty much just something written on a piece of paper and throwing and hoping it works out. It's really what's going on. Now, the other idea is actually military and diplomacy. A, we know the reaction type of stopping North Korea is any type of the diplomacy. Stopping exercises happened in 2018. B, stopping any type of bomber flights, meetings, secret meetings, so forth. This has all been active since the 1990s, as happening as specified with the Clinton administration. Now, most importantly, any type of any type of military might was stopped in 2018 to a good point. 2017 passed where bomber flights happened, aircraft carriers were seen floating nearby. All this stuff stopped to incite diplomacy between the U.S. and North Korea. Of course, now the problem is, does this stuff actually work? Yes, it does work in scaring them. Is it effective enough to stop them from their nuclear program? No. It makes them even progress further within their missile and nuclear program and even developing technologies mostly towards engaging air targets and naval targets. So the actual reaction in the world is a half and half. It's hard. Like most times, North Korea doesn't bite back or doesn't chew when people offer a stick. So overall, this is a problem that will prolong. But I'll pass the mic to Happening. Of course, you have anything else to add to the topic.
We have to view this from two sides. We have to view this as the world per se, as any country and their perspective on the DPRK, North Korea. And we also have to view it from North Korea's perspective, the DPRK's view in the world. And if you're the DPRK and you're looking at the United States, you see that the United States, as Global said, has not really been the most faithful in some of the deals they've made with countries in the past. They just look to Libya and Gaddafi, for example, the promise of denuclearization for economic rewards and benefits. But in the end, Gaddafi was invaded and Gaddafi was disposed and Gaddafi died a terrible death. Kim Jong-un looks at other dictators like Saddam Hussein in the past who did not get the nuclear weapon in time and got invaded and got deposed and executed. He looks at his country and his military and his armed forces, and he makes the calculation. If my country does not get nuclear weapons, we are going to possibly be more vulnerable to invasion by the US or South Korea or some other country. So we need to develop nuclear weapons as either as a chip for security and a bargaining chip in negotiations as well. We also look at the United States in terms of deals and administrations that change. North Korea looks to the Iran model, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iranian nuclear deal, made by the Obama administration, then left by the Trump administration, and trying to be re-entered by the Biden administration. And it looks at those previous deals and the inconsistencies, and they want a deal which is consistent across all administrations, regardless if they're Democrat, Republican, or independent. They want the deals to last, and they want the security guarantees to be irreversible. Now, the U.S. and other coalition countries in the West want North Korea to completely denuclearize with the old phrase used in the Trump admin, the all or nothing approach, complete, irreversible, and verifiable denuclearization. However, going for the all or nothing approach has pretty much led to nothing. It has not really produced many tangible, concrete developments. I would say the only thing that has successfully done is it successfully cooled the tensions of 2017 and removed that brinksmanship effect. Because in 2017, there were very high tensions between the US and North Korea, and thoughts of a quote unquote bloody nose military strike on North Korea was circulating across US media. There were rumors and unverified reports of potential military action, and people cannot distinguish, well, is this true or is this just unsubstantiated rumors if they didn't have the proper information and classified knowledge. But with the summit, all those tensions were able to ease, and they were able to get these symbolic deals, the symbolic deals that promised to do more concrete actions in the future. And that was a good first step, but they never took the second step. That was all that was done. When the US went for the all or nothing approach in the Hanoi summit in Vietnam, they ended up walking away from the deal because North Korea was not willing to, in the US's words, disclose some of their hidden nuclear sites or give them up for the next step of denuclearization. And so, quote unquote, experts have said that the best approach is something that the Biden administration may be trying to do, which is a step-by-step, phased, verified program for denuclearization. So essentially, give a little, get a little. Give up a little bit of sanctions, get a little bit verified progress going with North Korea. Maybe they shut down one nuclear facility. Maybe they get rid of some of their nuclear weapons, however you want to define it. And then as the progress gets verified by independent third-party inspectors, then you increase the progress. You do more sanctions removal, more nuclear weapons removed. And if the third-party inspectors find out that North Korea has violated their part of the deal, then the sanctions snap right back on. It's like they never even ended. That is something that at least I view as a potential way you could get some progress going. But it's also been shown in the past that both sides have been a bit unfaithful to the deals that have been made, cutting corners, not being the most transparent. So I also have skepticism about even if that approach will work. It's my view that any attempt at diplomacy is better than nothing, even if it doesn't eventually produce an outcome that works. But any attempt at diplomacy must have realistic goals, because if diplomacy goals are shoot for the moon or just wait for North Korea to do something to give up all their nukes without much prompting, neither of those are going to happen realistically. And so we'll see how this phased approach goes by the Biden admin. I would like to comment more on it, but we still don't know some details about it. We should find out more details as the upcoming weeks and months go by. And then we should have a better picture about how successful or non-successful this quote-unquote new policy will be.
Yeah, so I appreciate you emphasizing that. So actually, May, of course, this month on the 21st, Moon is actually coming to the U.S. to talk to President Biden, likely about North Korea, COVID, and so forth. So it's hard telling when the policy will come out. I'm hoping here soon, because I know the Biden administration does want to move and start making a movement on North Korea. But like I said, most recent hands out to North Korea from the Biden administration have been met with silence, or of course back in March when they agreed that they're not going to do talks till the hostile environment that the U.S. is creating is gone, which is the usual. This is nothing new, but they're going to continue to say that till, of course, a lot is kind of removed from the Korean Peninsula and so forth. Of course, I'm actually going to move down to more of the crazy subject of North Korea is actually provocations of kind of tension settling, why they do it, what they do, stuff like that. To pretty much start off, tension building, you would mostly is why would a country do that? So A is to get more leeway in terms of talks. B, of course, make them focus in the media so people talk about it. And C, and to dominate internal influence and dominate their external influence to, of course, the regional conflict and so forth. Of course, the most important two is 2010 with the artillery skirmish in C. And of course, the most important one I wanted to talk about is the March-April 2013 crisis. This is probably ones that really got me into North Korea when I woke up in the morning about this. So the idea in 2013, of course, was over the exercises. The exercises that the U.S. and South Korea do, Full Eagle, is a big thing that North Korea hates because they believe it's actually exercise for invading North Korea. But of course, the exercise was made as defensive nature from any type of North Korean provocation. So pretty much the intent happened between March 5th and ended on April 30th. Pretty much the midlife crisis of 2013 with North Korea. So what actually happened during this time was when the exercises fully started, they nullified the armistice. They started doing intense military exercises on their target. So they actually made rock-related structures and did artillery strikes, airstrikes on them, and decided to do more provocative military exercises that were definitely targeting South Korean U.S. targets. So pretty much once this was going on, both sides started reacting to each other. North Korea decided to, visit, of course, Unit 64, which is on the West Sea coast. This is a, of course, coastal defense unit, which is, of course, can start any type of provocative action during the end. Of course, North Korea decided to launch short-range missiles. They decided to begin the process of, destroying all ties with South Korea because of their hostile rhetoric. But most importantly, the biggest thing that people remember this day is actually North Korea did go into a combat duty readiness, which meant they mobilized their frontline forces. They actually mobilized their missile divisions. And my to emphasize mobilization, this mostly meant to a combat readiness posture. So when I say they mobilized their missile forces, so the idea is to get the understanding what the U.S. and South Korea saw, which actually meant South Korea and U.S. go into a combat force posture. Is North Korea actually rolled out their intermediate ballistic missiles. They started rolling out actual combat units that were, they're only going out to be able to sustain a conflict. North Korea doesn't do this for fun because they can't handle it. Their military can't handle any type of fun. They can't just pull out their units whenever they want to because of the cost doing it, maintenance, and so forth. North Korea doesn't have the capability to do random training exercises when they want, but they do have, spring and winter exercises to at least sustain their military in case something happens. But they actually mobilized their missile forces into launching positions. They actually mobilized their frontline forces. Armored were, of course, on the move, all this stuff. I mean, this is the worst possible scenario of a possible conflict on having on the Korean Peninsula is this. And this is what especially scared the U.S. and South Korea because this is almost as real as it was back in the 50s when things were being on the move. So when this was all going on, both sides were trading sides. And the U.S. and South Korea were already the WATCHCON. Of course, WATCHCON is the alert status of surveillance units. This was moved to the maximum, the DEFCON level. This is not the DEFCON level the U.S. has. This is the DEFCON level that is on the Korean Peninsula to readize, to mobilize their forces in case of a conflict. This was actually moved down to one of the highest levels since the 50s because of what was going on. And of course, there's a concept to this because my father was also deployed in Korea in 2009, 2010, and my brother was deployed in Korea in 2017. Both were combat units, so I definitely understand the process of what the U.S. would do. So in this process, in the terms of a mobilization of a possible conflict, most U.S. forces would be on the readiness posture, or you pretty much alarms go off, you get in your vehicles, you go to a forward point and hold there. This is all real. This is probably one of the worst points that was actually broadcast on television, what was going on. So, of course, both sides started, talking to each other. North Korea continued to launch short-range missiles. And then, things started going more and more worse of actually, North Korean soldiers actually going to up positions that were, of course, super close to DMZ and going from there. And then out of the blue, after the exercises concluded, North Korea decided, Kim Jong-un said that forces were returning to normal status, yada, yada. So they mobilized all their entire forces for absolutely no reason, just to start tensions, to make them, as a formidable opponent, do exercises and make them more leeway in future diplomatic actions. So this is just one of the stunts they do to make themselves on the world scene, make their military the might and all this stuff. So this is just one of the few kind of cycles of what we go through. We go through the diplomacy cycle. So when diplomacy actually happens between North Korea, provocations actually stop or they decrease. We don't see missiles fire. Of course, this is the same aspect since 2018. It was a very, kind of boring year for North Korean experts. We didn't see much happen. 2019 happened. Of course, we all saw these talks going down. and North Korea wasn't denuclearizing. They rebuilt Sohae, which is a satellite launch facility. Of course, they blew up their nuclear testing site, but of course, North Korea actually has multiple nuclear testing sites, so it's not really too much of a big deal for them. So pretty much when all this stuff started happening, they'll have a cycle. When diplomacy hits, they have a leeway period. Of course, we didn't see any missile tests till 2019, 2020, of course, and now this year. Of course, COVID 100% did stop the aspect of their military. Of course, it didn't stop their research or production, but it did stop the focus from more military applications to health, education, and information structures. But this is just a cycle what they go through. Of course, it always seems to be a thing. 2017 is definitely going to be brought up. Of course, that was the first time they actually launched an actual dedicated ICBM that was meant to reach the U.S. twice, and a nuclear test of a thermonuclear bomb. So these things happen for a reason. Of course, they're building up their military, but the problem is what's the stopping point? It's hard to say if they're ever really going to stop building, producing, and so forth till they have their way. But this is going to be a massive issue for the U.S. and regional allies for decades to come. It's just going to be. No one's really going to risk bombing North Korea to stop their missile nuclear program. We're at the point where that's kind of impossible now without devastating deaths on both sides. But this is just the tension aspect that North Korea does to get things done their way. It's pretty much their way or the highway in most talks they go into. Of course, it's like, oh, we're making progress. Then out of the blue, they say we're stopping diplomatic talks because of hostile rhetoric. They have their ins, they have their outs. They know how to close in the U.S. and close in South Korea. So it's pretty much it's just how they do things. I wouldn't like to say it's nothing to work up over every time they launch a missile. No, but it's important to know how far, what they're progressing on, what they're researching, going from there. So this is just a tension building prospect they do. Of course, another prospect to highlight is 2020 when they blew up the Inter-Korean liaison office because of the leaflets that North Korean defector groups from South Korea were launching over. Of course, this is just something that happened in June. They said they had military plans to pretty much remilitarize certain aspects of the DMZ. They were actually ordering coastal units to, launch targets if South Korean naval boats got too close, and they were just doing that. And now the blue, Kim Jong said, they stopped all military plans, and that was it. That's all you hear about it. So it's just an off and on cycle. There's a point where probably North Korea would be more comfortable to actually producing more kinetic provocations, which actually means mobilizing certain aspects of either their artillery, ground forces to engage in tiny to medium size engagement on other platforms. Of course, 2010 we saw the artillery skirmish, naval skirmish. Those are things that likely they might feel more comfortable doing, especially retaining a nuclear weapons and so forth now. But this will likely expect more in the future is all I got to say. It won't really stop, it won't really slow down. It's kind of just a wait and see process. But of course, I'll hand the mic to Happening, of course, if he has more to say about the topic.
Yeah, not much more to add in particular. I will say sometimes the media coverage does not match the proportion of how serious or not serious an incident can be. An example of this is the August 2015 border crisis between North and South Korea, which wasn't really as reported as the 2013 or 2017 crises. That was when the landmines on the DMZ maimed a couple of South Korean soldiers, and there was an exchange of artillery fire across the border. I saw a NK News podcast that said that one U.S. general claimed that was the most significant high point of tensions in the Koreas, not 2013, not 2017. Unfortunately, I don't remember the exact source for that, but even if I have some of the details wrong, the point still stands. The tensions can fluctuate. They go up and down. There are points where it's serious and points where it is calm. But when the tensions do rise and there is a point where decisions have to be made, the danger comes with miscalculation. Neither side wants a war. Neither side wants a conflict. Because if there is a conflict, there is a devastating human toll, a price to pay that may be too much. Actually, it is too much in my opinion. But at the end of the day, miscalculations are the biggest risk. Because all it takes is one miscalculation, one bullet fired in the wrong direction, one artillery piece that lands in the wrong place that can start the escalation cycle or the escalation ladder. Whereas you climb higher on the rungs of escalation, as the provocations increase in severity and scale, the potential for de-escalation becomes more difficult. Not impossible, but still more difficult. It's a ladder that wants to be avoided by both sides, but yet sometimes gets climbed regardless. There's also not just kinetic provocations towards the south, there's also the more significant missile tests. So when you see a headline on the news that says North Korea fired a missile or a projectile, they're not all the same in significance. Some are cruise missiles. Cruise missiles are not banned by United Nations Security Council regulations. And so basically those cruise missiles are like level 1 or 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. Then you have short-range ballistic missiles. These are technically banned by the UNSC, but most sides really just go through the game of going to a quote-unquote emergency meeting, talking about it, issuing some sort of vague verbal condemnation, just keeping the normal cycle of provocations going. Then there are medium-range missiles, ICBMs, as I talked about earlier. And there's also hypothetical tests that they could or could not do that people have speculated about. There is the most extreme type of missile test that could be possible. It would model the U.S. frigate bird test, and so people have tongue-in-cheek called it a Juche bird test. In essence, what that is putting a live nuclear warhead on an ICBM, firing it on a normal trajectory eastward because you have to test the normal trajectory to confirm it works, and then detonating it over the Pacific Ocean for a hydrogen Pacific nuclear test. This test, I don't think will actually ever happen, but if it ever does, it would confirm beyond a doubt that North Korea's nuclear weapons program not only is legitimate, but that is verified to work. It is the most extreme step. There are other potential provocations as well, like firing missiles around Guam. In 2017, after President Trump made the fire and fury threat towards North Korea responded by threatening to test missiles around the island of Guam, probably unarmed missiles, but to land 2 of them short of Guam and 2 of them just past Guam, which, if they did proceed to go through with such a test, would produce an unpredictable reaction from the U.S. They decided not to after calculating the potential risk and fallout of doing that, and they shelved those plans. So North Korea can quickly shelve plans that they bring up verbally, but it's still important to listen to what they say because you don't want to push someone who is frightened in a corner to do an action that they may regret in the future. Communication is important. Dialogue is important. Cooling down tensions is important to avoid climbing up the escalation ladder.
All right. Well, I appreciate that so far. I'm going to go ahead and have to step in and say that we've reached a little bit over what the goal was for the discussion portion of this. So I want to go real quick and just thank It's Happening in Global Mill. You guys have been great wealth of knowledge for all the topics we've discussed. I want to plan a second discussion to where we go more in depth on a couple of these topics, as well as some of the missed discussion points, and hopefully knock out just a remainder of this. I know that I would love to continue going, and this is something that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours, but we're not going to end it here. We're actually going to move towards the Q&A section. Same rules apply as last time. If you have a question and want to actually come up and speak, just use the raise your hand function, and then I'll pull people up in order. If not, I've got a couple questions that we can go over. We're going to take a quick up to about 5-minute break. So stand up, stretch your legs, walk around, and we'll be good to go from there. Let's go ahead and get right into it. We're going to go through our Q&A discussion now. And let me see. So no speakers. So I'll start with some questions that the audience has prepared before. So this one comes from the user, The Force, Can You Sense It? Should the United States accept North Korea as a nuclear power? And if it does, what are the ramifications for such a thing? So this is also in combination with another question I saw about how China and Russia might be off the record helping proliferate that program, just based on speculation that I've seen from talking heads. And I wanted to kind of get y'all's opinions on how the world would react if and when it ever happens that we just say, oh, well, there's really nothing we can do about their nuclear program now because they're too far gone.
Yeah, I know it is of course, it's almost like we could just say, that's it. Of course, we'll drop sanctions, your nuclear power, there's nothing we can do. Of course, that type of thinking, it's the idea of actually recognizing North Korea. It's not as far-fetched. It's becoming more of a reality of actually something we might have to do. Because I should definitely remind people that the U.S. of course accommodated, the United Kingdom, France, Israel, India, Pakistan, China, in gaining nuclear weapons. They weren't sanctioned, but they weren't. Of course, they kind of lived with it. Don't get me wrong. Washington has tried numerous attempts and stopping, saying Pakistan, India from abandoning their nuclear program, or stopping certain situations where they can only go so far. UK, they kind of rely on the US now on certain nuclear maintenance issues and so forth, but still they are nuclear capable. So I know the idea of actually accepting nuclear power, North Korea as a nuclear power is kind of far-fetched in certain circumstances, because I know we can definitely recognize them as nuclear power, but it doesn't really solve the issues of humanitarian reasons, their assassination attempts and so forth. So there's a lot more to it. Of course, the ramifications of doing so. It's really hard to say till we actually get to that point. I know that most cases is at this where we are now, while North Korea is pretty much a nuclear power, off the record type, without being official. They still do a whole bunch of other stuff that really no country kind of does. I know they do arms trade with, of course, Iran, Syria, and Uganda, for sake, and especially other African countries. And now the only issue people have with accepting North Korea's nuclear power, of course, this was an idea that came back, with George W. Bush, was the idea of North Korea actually trading their nuclear technology with another nation, say as Iran, a terrorist force. That's pretty much reasons why people are really reluctant in making North Korea retain their nuclear power, is because of the possible consequences that could happen of it, especially if they get too comfortable with it and countries get too comfortable with them being sanction relief, if that ever happens in a point. So there's a lot of points to it, and of course, you, ACR, and Happy, you might have more to add, but it's kind of my point of view. It's hard. Sure, it's probably the easiest thing to do, and probably just forget and give about it. But there's a lot of the unknown is what really worries national security advisors and experts.
So my 2 cents in the whole thing is the ramifications of allowing, and I say this as blunt as possible, of allowing the North Korean state to become a recognized nuclear power is, in my mind, unfortunately, the Kim dynasty is not going to last forever. I don't foresee it happening. I think there's way too many factors in play, and I don't want to risk having a situation that happened when the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred back in the 90s, of this fear that there's a bunch of nuclear weapons that are just unguarded, sitting in silos or sitting in warehouses or underground bunkers that nobody's able to account for. So while I think that what we're doing now is not necessarily the best plan, but it's a plan that helps prevent an outbreak of another war on the peninsula in most cases, I don't think that we should necessarily recognize them as a, quote, nuclear power. We can't really stop them now, but I think that we should be doing more and more to help denuclearize the peninsula.
Yeah, I know. It goes in your context of making sure, because I know the U.S. did help Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, was maintaining security of their nuclear weapons, funding them for security projects, salaries, so forth. But I know in the context of actually making sure, but of course the Kim regime will, like you said, will likely fall. It's just a matter of time of when and how. I know the idea is it's believed that China actually has a contingency plan to move into either into North Korea to either A, secure the nuclear weapons and nuclear facilities, so forth, or B, actually take over and make sure that the regime or at least some sort of government doesn't fall. So I do believe there is a fail-safe involved. I mean, I believe the U.S. and South Korea have the same concept. The problem is if we're going to have two superpowers, then move into the buffer zone of North Korea to secure weapons, and then either way, you're still having a West versus East moment. I know it's very hard to really assume what's going to happen until it actually happens. The problem is we don't know what's going to happen after it happens type scenario.
Yeah, I wanted to just share really quickly my thoughts on this as well. I think my answer is two parts to it. One, what I actually think is going to happen, but two, I also want to see is going to happen. I do think that the way things are going with North Korea, with just the lack of progress that's been happening throughout the years, it seems like the end result may be the unfortunate acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear program, even if it's implicit, even if it's not explicitly stated as we accept North Korea now. It just has come to the point that so many different attempts throughout so many different decades to denuclearize North Korea or to make some progress with it have ended up right back at the drawing board. So I'm not saying to give up on denuclearizing North Korea. I want to see definitely what the Biden administration does with it. But there are ways to denuclearize the North. There is the military option, but of course that you can't really do the military option unless you want to factor in thousands to tens of thousands, if not way more casualties, fatalities, possibly getting North Korea to use their nuclear, biological, chemical weapons, and all that ugly, nasty stuff. That is the most straightforward way to denuclearize, but clearly it's not an acceptable option. There's also the options that have been tried in the past, but as we've seen historical examples in the past of diplomacy efforts falling apart, I do think they should keep going with this new Biden approach and see what happens with that. But it's just my thinking more pessimistically that we may end up just passively accepting the North as a nuclear state without ever officially saying it, and just going to deterrence instead. So if we can't denuclearize the North, at least we can deter and give them a million reasons why ever using those nukes would be a horrible idea, to never do so, and to be ready just in case the North has a destabilizing event for any possible potential outcome.
Absolutely. So I appreciate both answers. I think that question got answered pretty well. It kind of goes back to the whole adage of we don't want to promote the proliferation of a nuclear state, and that's why I believe we're so hard on nations like Iran. But as it was stated earlier, the Kim dynasty sees nuclear weapons as a way to secure their eternal power. They saw what happened to Gaddafi. They saw what happened to Saddam. They've seen what happens to despot dictators out in any part of the world, that if the U.S. gets a little upset, you're probably gone. And they don't want that. And they figured, if I have a nuke and I threaten Seoul with it, they can't necessarily take me out. And that's gone from just having one nuke in theoretically, 1993, to having a decent handful now. I think the latest numbers were, correct me if I'm wrong, like 20 to 30. And they had a few actual hydrogen bombs now after the tests that they conducted. So it's hard. That's probably one of the most difficult questions I think that I could have asked. So I want to go into a more reliable, and I say that as kind of more of everybody kind of understands this one as, so China views North Korea as more or less a buffer zone from today's standpoint. Back in the 60s, the 70s, after the split with the Sino-Soviets, it was to basically use Korea or North Korea as a buffer from the American West and South Korea. They helped prop up a lot of the early regime after the Armistice Agreement in the 50s. And for a while there, North Korea was the technological superpower in the region, comparatively speaking to South Korea. So China deflects a lot of North Korea's actions by saying, both sides need to be de-escalating both sides. They always try to make sure to sew in the West. Do you think China still sees North Korea as an ally, or do you think that they're more of the like annoying stepbrother that they kind of have to take over and watch because mom's out of the picture and dad's gone with the fall of the Soviet Union? They're not getting funding, and now they're having to do it themselves by quote unquote saber rattling. And do you think that the Chinese Communist Party sees it as a favorable or a less favorable event to keep the North Korean regime up? I know that was a lot. I tried to combine about 3 or 4 questions into that. So pick it apart, tell me what you think, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, so I know this is actually a somewhat more discussed aspect of having, China. I mean, like I said, the Soviet Union helped North Korea prop up in the beginning stages before the Korean War. That's true. But China became a key part, especially when the intervention it did in the 50s to actually prop up the regime and continue making it forward one of its own children. But yes, I would actually classify North Korea to China as a troublesome, as PBRT said, as a troublesome younger brother or just some trouble kid. I know. I mean, if it was actually a proper ally, it would have a lot more resources available to it. But no, it's to a point troublesome to China. But the reason they are propping it up, still doing economic assistance, probably technology assistance, domestic coverage, stuff like that, is to keep it as a buffer zone. It will continue to be troublesome, so that's why China does get involved and say, North Korea and the West should calm down, because China knows what the West is doing to either aggravate North Korea, but even though since it's all defensive in nature. But the idea that pretty much, China's really keeping North Korea alive. If North Korea, or if China stopped every single function of economic existence, the regime will likely fall. If you go back and look at UN available data, databases of the actual trading between the two countries, China's one of the biggest. Don't make it wrong. There's actually European countries, there's African nations, Russia, they all trade. Even South Korea trades with North Korea to a certain extent if they're not sanctioned. But like I said, most things get around from just not listening to sanctions, doing whatever they want to do. But yes, 100% I would agree that North Korea is a troublesome to pretty much all regional allies, even if China props it. But China is keeping them afloat to avoid there's 2 things: to avoid the issue of nuclear weapons, and B, to stop the refugees, because what would happen is if the government actually collapsed, all those refugees would likely go towards China. Because of the relationship they have with each other. Some, without doubt, would likely try to make their way down to South Korea and other Western allies, or maybe even Russia. But the majority of them would actually influx to China, and that's actually what they want to avoid. Back in 2017, there was a lot of rumors of actually China stepping up their military divisions near the Sinpo, China and North Korean border. I believe some of those were actually true to the point because they were afraid what was actually going to happen with Trump coming in, this full year, and with this fire and fury talk to North Korea, there actually were fears and movements that were depicting that Bolino strike was very seriously on the table, and China was very scared that the U.S. did move forward with military strike on North Korea. You just opened Pandora's box, and a whole bunch of people were going to start making their way to China, and nuclear weapons were kind of free for both countries. So I would definitely agree. They're troublesome, and they likely will remain troublesome. But I know they will attempt their best to maintain economic assistance and diplomatic outreach between both countries, just to maintain influence and maintain a regime for the time being.
Yeah, not too much again to add to Global's comments. I will say that China knows how to play the geopolitical game with the verbal rhetoric that they use. If they really want something or some territory or some country to have to cave in more to China's demands, they will do that. For example, they had tensions with India. They have extreme tensions with Taiwan, for example, who they view as part of their territory. But that's outside the scope of this discussion. I guess with North Korea in particular, I would say they view them as a bit of both, a bit of an ally and an annoying younger brother, per se. If North Korea did not exist and South Korea was just Korea, aligned to the United States as they are today, then that means the United States could place troops right next to China's border. And that would be quite detrimental to China's security, to basically just the geopolitical region in general. they want to avoid that at all costs. So if they were to stop funding North Korea and stop the trade with North Korea and allow the dynasty and the regime to fall, then who would stop the U.S. from sending troops up to China's border for the sake of security, for the sake of deterrence, etc.? Now, at the same time, even though North Korea is helpful in that regard, they also cannot fully be controlled by China. They aren't a puppet state of China, despite what some people may say. North Korea is in itself a sovereign state. They have full control of their nuclear weapons. They conduct provocative tests, which China would like to calm down. Essentially, if all North Korea did was provide the buffer between China and South Korea without ever conducting further nuclear tests and just sticking to their own self-defense with little rhetoric as possible, China would love that. But North Korea has their own interests in mind as well, and sometimes that may clash with China. But as we're seeing more recently, as the U.S. and China's tensions and relations continue to deteriorate, China would like to increase their relations with North Korea more, and just their other allies in the region as well, just to continue to provide more geopolitical pieces of chess on their side.
Wow, those were the answers I was really looking for in that discussion. So it comes back to the whole, speaking of China, that at one point China had to adopt a state quasi-capitalist economy to function. They had to adapt to the new world. When the new millennia came in, China went from really not producing much to being a massive economic exporter of goods and services to the rest of the world. Today, they're one of the largest producers of goods, almost period. And that might be because of the population, but that's more than likely because they realize that their economic system going into the new millennia wasn't going to work. Same thing happened in Vietnam, where they adapted more of they have a communist party, but they have a capitalist state-controlled economy. So in North Korea, there's a lot of black market goods, especially around media. There's a lot of DVD players that get smuggled into the country. There's a lot of Western media that gets smuggled in either through air balloon drops with leaflets, either through smugglers coming in from China, or people bringing stuff in just illegally in general. Do you think that this is going to be a three-part question? A, that the black market that North Korea mainly runs on outside of worldview has any influence on the Kim regime? B, that it would ever be feasible for North Korea to switch to a more state capitalist a la China or Vietnam type of economic system, and would it appease the West? And C, do you think that they would be able to expand their economic diplomacy period with that new model or with their current model without it ruffling feathers in the West? And I know that's a lot, so pick apart what you can, and like I said, we'll just go on.
Yeah, so I know the economy, it's definitely a focal point of North Korea whenever it's fully discussed, because we all know what sanctions do and their impact on the regime and so forth. So I know actually Kim Jong-un's father, Jong-il, actually was more against any type of reform to their economy, even during the famine period of the 90s. It wasn't really until Kim Jong-un until actual proper economic reforms were going under place, because Kim actually understands the importance of private markets, consumer items, business ventures, and so forth. So it's really hard to understand if we'll actually begin more of a reform like Vietnam, China, in terms of actually in regards to the economy. Now, I would say if sanctions were fully done and North Korea was actually recognized as a proper sovereign state, in most cases without any type of provocations, it's really hard to say 100% they would have to do an economic reform, because the black market is actually set to benefit from sanctions, not benefit without them. So they would actually have to pretty much begin their economy from the ground up again. After all these years from sanctions, vendors, traffickers, all are benefiting from this current black market type system they have. Now, it's really hard because I don't know too much the point of where things go within their economy, how they look at it. I just understand that the state is pretty much authorizing a lot of these vendors to sell black market goods, even though certain people are not allowed to have them. They still benefit from it. They still recommend it. the idea of actual true reforms is hard telling. I mean, at the moment, Kim is likely buying himself time through the current process. Because, of course, his main goal probably throughout his entire life will be sanction relief or economic relief. That's going to be his number one goal. Based in 2017, he already retained nuclear weapons. So it's still going to be a definite goal for defense. But in terms of true sight, same as the 5-year plan that he reenacted of this year, his main goal will be having a prospering economy like Singapore once they went to Singapore, all that fun stuff. He saw the cities, he saw what they did, all that stuff. He wants North Korea to look like a proper economical sovereign state within the world. I know mostly in the aspect of, would they change? Probably. If it actually benefited the regime, they would. 100%, but at the moment it's hard telling based on how intertwined their economy is with the black market. Now, to answer your question about pretty much if things were a bit better, how the diplomacy would do. Even probably if sanctions were, kind of done, trade would likely speed up. It's hard telling how many people would be comfortable trading with North Korea knowing what they do now. But I mean, at the moment, they do still have a way to influence economic decisions over other countries and themselves, of course, through arms trade with African nations, Iran, Syria, drug trafficking, of course, slave labor. We can see that, and Russia and China. Now, people know the people who are sent over to China, Russia are not volunteering to do so. They're actually forced by the state. If they ever try to flee or so forth, their family does get imprisoned or killed. So they do have things like that. Of course, number one thing we hear about so often is the influence they have with their cyber crimes. Of course, Sony's been hit back in 2014 to 13. Malware, even NK News was hit recently. All this stuff. So cyber crimes are real, and they've been gathering so much money from it, and it's been benefiting themselves and so much what they do. But like I said, there's a difference between actually gaining money and how to actually what to use it for. Most cases, a lot of it will be to prospering the Kim regime, the military, and then economic relief is when it boils down to. A lot of it doesn't actually transfer to the normal North Korean citizen, but of course Kim tries to, because North Korea without its citizens is not North Korea. It's just a wannabe place. So the idea of actually kind of benefiting from any type of economic diplomacy is probably there. But at the moment, they're actually to a point thriving off of these, illicit trades or crimes. But like you say with your third question about kind of influence they would have, it's really hard telling how many nations would be comfortable trading with North Korea once things kind of, if they ever boil over. But it's really hard to say until we actually get to that point.
Unfortunately, I haven't really followed the black market scene in North Korea, so I can't really answer part of that question. What I will say in general is that Kim Jong-un wants to stay in power at all costs, and whatever means are necessary to do that, he will implement. If that means opening up more economic reforms, he will do that. However, opening up the economy has risks because it leads to more openness just in general, more potential for the spraying of contraband information, as I talked about in the past. And any excessive amount of information and prosperity can lead the people to perhaps even try to overthrow his regime, try to search for a better life elsewhere. If they get a taste of something that's good, they may want more. They may not be content with just bare economic reforms. The current system at the moment is still emphasizing the importance of self-reliance, that we as North Korea can survive on our own despite sanctions. We will persevere and power through despite what's going on, because I'm sure Kim Jong-un wants to have the stability of power and the economic stability like you may see in Singapore and Vietnam. But he also realizes that the more economic reforms that he opens up, there's also an increased chance that his own regime can be overthrown just based on how his own system works. It would be quite interesting if somehow he did open up the economy more and that the people could get a taste more of the outside world than what they currently have. But at this point, it seems like with the funds that come in with, say, the black market or, say, hacking schemes, it may be more than sufficient to strengthen his grip on power, strengthen the regime's funding, even though the people may suffer because of it. If it doesn't threaten his rule, he'll be okay with it.
That's amazing answers, and I want to thank you both for giving your contributions, as well as thank you both for giving contributions as a whole to this talk. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up. Time is kind of getting away from us, and I know that I spoke to Global Mill last night, and I said, man, we could literally sit here for hours and talk about North Korea. And we could do this as a multi-part series if needed. But unfortunately, that's where I'm going to have to call it for today. It's been wonderful having both of you along for this. I want to appreciate both of you. Please be sure to plug your social media and Twitters, any of that. For our listeners that aren't able to make it and hear my voice now, just know that we are hosting this on the Project Owl Discord. That's discord.gg/Project Owl. So please join us for the next one. I will have an announcement out here shortly for the potential of a new speaker next week. I still have to iron that out. But just to kind of wrap it up, North Korea's got a lot of information and a lot of stuff that we in the OSINT community could potentially learn just from paying a little bit more attention. I want to turn more of an OSINT style talk about North Korea and what we can use to learn from them, because beyond what they present, it's more or less what they want us to see, not what they don't want us to see. So thanks again, guys. And if you guys could go ahead and just plug your stuff, I'll go ahead and wrap it up from here. Also, the discussion and question section will be left open so users can have their questions answered.
So of course, you can follow me on global_mil_info on Twitter, or just type in global. It should pop up for the first one. My DMs are always open on Discord and Twitter. In most cases, if you actually want to actively talk to me, North Korea or any other type of event, see you on the Project Owl Discord. I'm always available, so don't be afraid to shout out or wanted to have a conversation with me.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for listening to this talk today. I appreciate you taking the time to do so. I'm on Twitter as accurate_intel. That's accurate_intel. And DMs as well as globals will be open here on Discord and Twitter as well. Thank you all for coming.
All right, and with that, we're going to wrap it up. I appreciate everyone. Thank you for coming to the second iteration of Owl Talk, and I look forward to our next discussion next week. Y'all take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.